Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome to the stage Anne O'Leary of Jenner and Block and our esteemed panel.
Welcome, everyone. I'm Anne O'Leary with Jenner and Block, and so pleased to be here today. You're here at a panel in which we are discussing decentralized governance, giving power away. And I want to just say how important and unusual it is in these times to be sitting here with this terrific panel that is both international, uh, cross-partisan, and really is working to think about the incredible geopolitical issues that are happening at the cross-section with technology. One of the other things that is really fascinating is that one of the tech companies in the United States took a very unusual move in 2020, and that is Meta, previously known as Facebook, in which it decided that the decisions that it was making were too large and too complicated for a small set of people in the executive suite in Silicon Valley to be making those decisions that impact so many people around the world. And so they became the first company to actually give some power away to what we now know as the Independent Oversight Board, which was started in 2020. And I'm so pleased that we have a member of the Oversight Board here with us today. What we're going to do is to, instead of taking time to individually introduce everyone, I'm going to just begin by asking questions and ask folks to introduce themselves as we go. I'll start by really opening up the conversation to the person to my right, Brent Harris, and have him introduce himself more fully. Brent is with Meta. And one of the things that I think is really important is to kind of understand how this came about and how we began to think about this within the company. And so, Brent, maybe you can start by giving us some context for this decision and how you've seen it unfold over the last 2 years.
Perfect. Well, thank you for the question, Anne, and thank you to all of our panelists for joining us today. So we started on this journey in 2018 when we reflected as a company on the content decisions that we were taking. And we were making decisions at the time on behalf of about 2 billion people across the world, nearly every country. And today we're making those decisions on behalf of over 3 billion people. And in 2018, what we did was we actually went out and we hosted a global consultation. So we asked people, who do you think should decide on content? Who do you think should decide on some of the hardest matters? And what we heard back was, and this was, I think, no surprise to us, that actually folks don't want us deciding alone as a private company, as Meta. What they want to do is empower people who are beyond the walls of the company to take those decisions. And they wanted those people to be experts. They wanted them to look to global human rights. They wanted them to be independent of the company. So we set up a separate trust. And we then built a board that today is about 23 people. It's taken 29 decisions. That's made over 100 recommendations to improve the company. And we're excited about where this is going. We think that this is the right model for how such consequential matters of content should be taken, that they should not be made inside of a private company alone. And we also believe that this is the beginning of ways of handing over power, empowering users, empowering communities, and empowering others to actually build the internet and build the social media platforms that they want to be a part of.
Thank you, Brent. So we're 2 years into this social experiment, and in some sense, I want to say Meta took an advance that was incredible and that was voluntary, but it was also, in some sense, maybe you thought it was required in the sense that there were so few regulatory frameworks that were happening around the country and the globe, which I want to bring into the conversation. But before I do, I want to turn it to the Oversight Board member who we have here today, Nighat Dad, who should tell a little bit about her background, which is pioneering. And what I'd like you to start, in addition to your introduction, is maybe say a little bit about, as you reflect on the last 2 years, What do you think have been the greatest successes of this governance model and also some of the greatest challenges that you're seeing?
Yeah, thank you, Anna. Well, I live in Pakistan and I run Digital Rights Foundation, a nonprofit organization, beside being part of the oversight board. Um, so we had some great successes in last 2 years, and I think as a digital rights activist, what I have been saying for the last 1 decade that companies really need to look into the contextual sort of details when it comes to content moderation, or look into different context when it comes to um, so not only companies but also governments when they talk about regulations, and I think we'll get into that conversation later. But at the board, so far we have received 1.6 million appeals, and it shows that the users of the platform have a trust on this self-regulatory mechanism, and they think that the board can listen to them and then can decide on the cases that the platform couldn't look into.
Like,
um,
can I make you pause for 1 second because this is fascinating, and I want to make sure people understand it. So, 1.6 million appeals.
yes.
Maybe say 1 second about the process of determining which of those 1.6 million appeals you're going to be able to uh, consider.
Yeah, so the way we at the board work is we look into cases and choose cases which not only impact one certain jurisdiction and context. We try to set precedent through those cases and decisions, and that precedent means that it won't only impact that particular context, but it will impact similar contexts and jurisdictions. So I'll give you an example. For instance, we decided just recently, a week ago, we released a case on related to Afghanistan conflicts, where journalists and media organizations have been reporting on Taliban, and the policy of the platform Meta on dangerous individual and organization has this particular thing around praise. So if you write Taliban, their content automatically, the company takes down. So, media organizations and journalists in South Asia had a very difficult time to report on that particular context, which was actually a massive global, conflict that was happening in that part of the world. So we decided on that case, and we overturned Meta's decision, and we asked them to look into their community guidelines on that particular dangerous individual and organization. And this is just one case. There's several other decisions where we asked Meta to look into the regional languages. When we talk about centering users into our conversation, or when platforms are designing their products and features, how they are looking into the user. And exactly that's what we are doing, bringing users into the conversation in the center, and not only users, but also the international human rights framework of freedom of expression.
Well, that's very helpful. One of the things that I want to kind of contrast with, as Meta is doing this, we are seeing in the United States, in some sense, a lack of a regulatory framework and inability for Congress to act on some of these. And we'll bring in the folks from the United States on this part of the conversation. But we also are seeing Europe fully move forward with a regulatory framework. And so I'm interested in how that intersects with what Facebook is trying to do. So let me actually first call on our European Member of Parliament, Ms. Hahn, if you can introduce yourself and say a little bit about what you're doing, and just give the context of what we're seeing in the European Parliament and how you think this impacts the conversation.
Thank you very much. It's actually so interesting for me to hear, the view from the American perspective. Because in Europe, we are very much on the forefront on legislation, on regulation on tech companies. We're not so much leading on the actual tech companies itself. And I mean, there's a reason it's called the Brussels effect. We're good at setting standards and setting the framework and inspiring others. We have seen that with the regulation on storing of private data, of personal data, with the so-called GDPR, and we're seeing it now with the legislation. We have very big digital files, the so-called DSA and DMA, Digital Market Act and Digital Service Act, in which the European Union is setting a framework of responsibilities of platforms, how to deal with illegal content, and the overall question, where is the line of law enforcement? Because in my opinion, first and foremost, is the state that has to enforce its rules. And where is the line to private companies having responsibilities? And what role of the state can and should they even be taking over? So I think this is all where it comes together then with the question of the oversight board. Because you already mentioned it, what is freedom of speech? Where's the thin line? You have governmental rules coming together with the community rules of platforms and services like Meta. So it is a very difficult framework to set. I mean, we're not only talking about companies coming from another democratic country. We're also having big platforms coming, for example, from China, where it's much more difficult to enforce legislation, for example. And I think this clash of our world that we're seeing right now, also in a full-grown war, is authoritarian regimes versus democracy. And the digital world really is going to be the next line of how can we make sure that democratic rules, freedom of speech are upheld, and how do we balance it out with responsibilities of platforms. And this is what we're working on the European level. I think we have set some milestone legislation. We're in the dialogue with our US partners in the Trade and Technology Council. And ideally, I think we'll be able to set a whole framework together.
Great, thank you. Let me call on Dave as well, our other European, and to say a little bit about what you're seeing in terms of this impact of the regulatory framework, and also just acknowledge and recognize that obviously the United States framework with the First Amendment is different, and so is it possible that the Europeans are able to do something that we cannot do here for that reason?
Impossible. The Europeans could do something you couldn't in the US.
Thank you. Very appropriate answer.
Thank you, and good morning, everybody, and thank you, Concordia and Meta, not only for having me join this panel, but also for taking the lead in a really important area. One could argue long overdue, but it's a very well taken lead now. Clearly, it's a broad and deep area with a great many issues. As to who should and can regulate, I almost take the view that the question should arguably be moot because nations and groups of nations will ultimately legislate. But there are two challenges when it comes to countries legislating in this area. One is speed. America has been particularly slow in regulating. The EU has been much faster. But no country, no government will keep up with the speed and the pace of tech. The other issue with nations regulating is knowledge, and speaking as someone who spent the last 15 years fighting the big tech companies for removal, in many cases, of really nasty, really damaging content online in really unusual circumstances, it's very comforting to me, but also somewhat daunting to me that the most qualified regulatory board in the world on this area is that of Meta. So huge credit to Meta, but slightly daunting that no government anywhere can keep up with that. And that's a good thing because there's also real merit in platforms regulating and the way that Meta is going about that in a transparent and in a way, a community-led way is fascinating. But platform regulation brings, I suppose, the possibility of a lowest common denominator, where in regimes that perhaps don't share our values, there are at least some rules in place across the board. But platform regulation also brings two very large challenges that I think we should address this morning. One is when a platform looks to regulate internationally rather than nationally, whose values do you base those decisions on? And that might sound like a really easy decision to make, because if you consider our Western democratic values relative to those of authoritarian regimes, it's an easy one to answer. But closer to home, there are very, very real differences in our values. In the US, one of the most difficult meetings I ever had to deal with was when we had identified a huge amount of extreme content being promoted deliberately to groom interested moderates in the West. It was being amplified unnaturally. It was being created and promoted in a way designed to harm. And we talked to a number of Western governments, all of whom really bought into the idea of the mitigation that was readily available. And then we came to the US, where freedom of speech is all. And the meeting I had with the US government, where they said, yeah, we get what you're saying, but we can't really touch this because freedom of speech and all that. And are they really the values that we want to base our global regulation on? Arguably in the EU, there's a more nuanced view, especially around things like freedom of speech, when it comes to issues of harm to our children, real physical security threats to our people, and other vicious harms online. And the other issue, I think, with platform regulation is, and possibly the elephant in the room here, is the inevitable conflict of interest. Platforms have existed on a business model that relies on surveillance capitalism. The more data you, I, and we put online, the more the platforms can monetize that data. And as we move into the metaverse, where the amount of data online available about every one of us will be more, we have a bigger and bigger challenge. And I suspect that most of the platforms, excluding present company, will be very, very happy to talk about regulation around cross-compatibility, regulation around content and defining harmful content, but slightly less happy to talk about regulation around privacy, which to me is all important.
Great. Thank you so much, David. I really appreciate that. I want to bring in both Secretary Johnson and Ambassador Green into this conversation and acknowledge and recognize, some of what you just highlighted, Dave, which is that this is very complicated and very dangerous, which is sometimes when it is wrong, when the decision is wrong, whether it's the company, whether it's the oversight board, whether it's the inability to look at something, real world consequences happen. And Secretary Johnson, who was the Secretary of Homeland Security during the Obama administration, was of course at the front lines of this. And so Secretary Johnson, I think it would be helpful to, get your perspective, both when you were sitting in government, how you began to think about this, and you were, there at a critical time. I was working for a presidential candidate who did not win in 2016, and you were the Secretary of Homeland Security, and we saw just incredible election confusion, I would say, and I'd say confusion rather than interference intentionally, because I don't know that we knew at that time, leading up to the election, that it was interference. But later, of course, we learned a lot more. Can you say, how you think about this framework in a government in which there's not a regulatory piece, but it becomes so critical to understand how you begin to think about this and what your advice is now, both for the company and for policymakers? Just a few small questions.
Yes, thank you very much. So when you ask multiple questions, the speaker just picks the one he wants to answer.
Exactly. That's right.
Welcome everybody to New York. I'm a New Yorker. I work just a block away from here. That says Jeh Johnson, U.S. Department of Homeland Security. As Ann pointed out, I am the former secretary. I do not have that job anymore. So I'm a private citizen with free speech rights. This week, when I was in office, used to be my nightmare because of the UN General Assembly here in New York. The Secret Service, the U.S. Secret Service, was responsible for the overall security of the UN General Assembly. We'd have hundreds of world leaders in town. Secret Service is part of DHS. And 2015 was the biggest one. We had 170 world leaders, including, of course, President Obama, Xi of China, Putin of Russia, and the Pope. And the Pope wanted no security. He was a humble man, I was told. He doesn't want any armored vehicles. He doesn't want barricades, doesn't want magnetometers. And if he sees them, he will walk. He will not ride. Okay. So we gave him his Fiat, we gave him his Pope Mobile, and I did not take a breath until I saw that airplane leave and go back to Rome. Anyway, Anne brings us back to 2016 when we saw the Russian government making an active effort to put its thumb on the scale and elect Donald Trump versus Hillary Clinton. What I was most focused on in the face of all of that was the cybersecurity of our election infrastructure to ensure that a foreign power did not in some way tamper with the votes, the vote reporting, so forth. The emerging storm that frankly we did not fully see, recognize, and embrace at the time was what was happening on social media and the disinformation, the promotion of fake news on social media by Russian actors. We now have a much better understanding of it all than we did in 2016. Um, my view is and has been that in a free nation such as ours, with free speech rights, the government should not be in the business of trying to regulate Meta, Google, or anybody else in the determination of what constitutes fake news. Our politics are such that one man's fake news is another person's political talking points. We should not give to government actors the power to deem something fake news and therefore banned. I think it is therefore incumbent on companies such as Meta to do what Meta has done, which is to set up an independent, diverse board of experienced individuals to make these determinations in an objective way. Whether or not there should be some form of overarching board for the industry gets into, I suspect, some real interesting antitrust issues. But I think Meta has moved in the right direction here, and that a sure sign of success is when you're not in the news too often. And I don't believe the oversight board has been, that controversial. You're doing your job day by day, and almost certainly making legitimate decisions. But I think this for social media is got to be the wave of the future.
Thank you so much. That's, I think, really helpful context. And I think, one of the things that we struggle with, I think, being US-centric is remembering to lift our heads and to think about what is this like when we have over 3 billion users around the country, around the world, in I think 150 plus countries. We really have a lot to understand geopolitically. So, Ambassador Green, you're at the Woodrow Wilson Center. You've spent time thinking about the geopolitics. Give us your perspective on how we consider this, and maybe I should say not just U.S.-centric, but European-centric, because we're looking at the regulatory state. But in terms of the global majority and what's happening around the world, give us your perspective.
Thanks, Ann, and it's good to be here. And these are complicated and difficult, but really important issues to take up. So let me give you a couple of quick anecdotes that help to illustrate the ramifications of all this. So I used to lead USAID and was involved in the Ebola response in Eastern DRC. Deaths went up in DRC even after we had a vaccine and even after we had interventions. Why? Because it wasn't simply a public health crisis, it was a governance crisis, and nobody believed the government there. And so people wouldn't come forward to take the vaccine because they've heard all sorts of things coming out of the government. That's a reminder of the implications here. And when you're dealing with an epidemic or pandemic, the implications are global. What happens in DRC, we actually have to care about. It matters to us. Secondly, I think a really interesting innovation during the Biden years. It's been a remarkable, in my opinion, success. So as Vladimir Putin was ramping up his disinformation and all that goes with it, the swiftness with which the Biden administration moved to declassify intelligence, put it out there, and preempt the false flag operations, which I think was an enormous success, and a reminder that we have to be actively engaged in these sort of discussions and issues. One thing I don't think we're doing very well that we need to do more of. So to the extent that there's controversy, and we're just in, as you know, looking towards the height of the midterm elections this fall, I think some of it can be avoided or preempted by not teeing up the answers and decisions, but teeing up the questions. Have people understand the choices that you are being forced to make. And the good sense and common sense of the American people, I think people will look and say, okay, that's a tough choice, but we get why you're making it. I think we run the risk of simply announcing our outcomes and then everybody projects into it depending upon which side of the spectrum you're on, which end of the spectrum, everybody projects into it worst case scenarios. It's a conspiracy and all that drives with it. If in fact you work with universities, work with different institutions to say, look, these are the types of choices that we're taking up, I think that will not get rid of all of the controversy, but I think it will certainly help people to have greater faith in private sector tech. And I personally agree with Jeh Johnson on regulation. The late humorist P.G. O'Rourke used to say he felt the same way about Congress going into session as when you give a hammer to a baby. And I look at efforts to regulate, if by the time you can actually get the votes to do that, it will almost certainly be out of date, out of technology, moot, and then try undoing it. And so to the extent that we can have the types of entities and decision making that Meta is going through, I think, quite frankly, so much the better.
That's a helpful perspective. I want to bring in former Congressman Glenn Nye into the conversation to comment on that because, you know, I think that there is on both sides of the aisle, there's a feeling of deep trouble of the concentration of power in Silicon Valley, and it's not a left or right issue. It really is across the spectrum, and yet also an inability to regulate for many of the reasons you just mentioned, Ambassador. So as a former member of Congress and as a scholar of Congress and the presidency, can you say more about what you think is going to happen or how we should think about this in terms of the inaction in Congress?
Yes, and thank you for the opportunity. And I should start by saying I'm coming at it from the perspective of someone who runs a think tank now that called the Center for the Study of the Presidency and Congress that looks at the relationship between the presidency and Congress and how they are able or unable to solve particular sets of issues. And I think we have to start with accepting a hard truth, and that is that our political dialogue in the United States right now is not well oriented to coming to consensus on some of these hard questions. I think that's probably the understatement
That's
of
the
the day.
understatement of the
And
day,
I
right.
think my Republican colleague would agree with me on this. And that's unfortunate, but it is what it is. And I think in a conversation about devolving power, I think we have to accept that's a great goal, but you need a recipient for the devolution of the power. And our current public debate is not well oriented. Part of that has to do with hyper partisanship that is roiling our country right now. But and that's a topic for another hour and a half panel at least. But an element of it also, I think, is education. And we're talking about the role of government in regulating some of these questions. I think we've got to take one step back for a moment and admit that we need a quantum leap increase in our education of Americans to their understanding of the basic precepts of some of these questions. How do these digital platforms really work? How do they gather data? How does data flow? How are things promoted? How do people that choose to run ads get targeted to them? So what are they seeing on their platform? I'll give credit to Meta for both giving some power to an independent oversight board and for doing some education on their website in terms of the basics of how some of that works, but we need to go a lot further. To a large extent, this is a government responsibility. If it were up to me, I would have every state education system replace the old home economics with digital economics. And every student in this country would graduate with a pretty solid understanding both of things like cyber hygiene, but also just how does digital economics work? When I sign up for my favorite platform that doesn't cost anything to join, what's really going on and how does the information flow? If we did that, I think the debate would make more sense. We'd get to a closer to consensus faster. But that again is a relatively long-term component of the challenge. I do think in the meantime, though, the responsibility doesn't all fall on any individual company. And again, credit to Meta for setting up an independent oversight board. I would love to see the company take further steps. For example, what might be helpful is just one idea, but maybe task the oversight board with doing some independent study on how well the users of the platform really do understand how information flows and making recommendations for how to improve that. Again, this is largely a government responsibility, but we have to accept that, at least in the short term, let's be not overly optimistic about how fast that's going to change.
Right.
And looking for ways for maybe the company to step up and do a little bit more on that.
Yeah, and I think, I want to, Ambassador Green wants to comment on this. And I think just to say, it was only a few short years ago in which members of Congress were asking Meta, how do you make your money? I mean, literally not knowing what the actual business model was and the fact that it was an advertising model. So I think that, one of the things that happened last week when there was a hearing is that it was a much more knowledgeable questions from Congress members and, senators, which I think is a step forward, but get your point, Ambassador Green, and then I want to bring Roy Austin into the conversation.
First off, at the Wilson Center, one of the things that we do is provide trainings to members of Congress and Hill staff, and it's demand driven. And interestingly enough, this is the area that is most demanded. And so I think there
So
is
you're saying we get to blame you.
we get to blame. Careful, but no, it's interesting to me that this is what Hill staff are looking at. I think there's a recognition that they don't necessarily have the technical knowledge to be able to do this the right way, and they want to be able to take up these issues. Point I wanted to add, so in one of my past lives, I led a democracy organization, the International Republican Institute, which does election monitoring all around the world. And it's interesting that IRI and its counterpart NDI do media literacy training for new democracies, recognizing around the world that in so many places we have countries that are coming from authoritarian backgrounds and don't sort of have this responsive give and take built into their political systems. And I do think media literacy, platform IT, social media literacy really should be part of basic education that we provide here. One way to avoid, quite frankly, clumsy or slow regulations is to empower people so they have a greater awareness on the decisions that Meta and others are having to make. So I think what we used to call media literacy really is an essential part of civic education these days. It's hard to be an engaged, informed, and effective citizen, quite frankly, if you don't have some grounding in that area.
Yeah, and I want to come back to, how the tech world and Meta in particular can continue to empower users. I first want to turn to Roy because one of the things that Meta has done, which is also quite unusual, is to hire somebody who is a very well-respected, high-profile, high-level thinker in the civil rights community to lead the effort there. And I think if we think about, who is most impacted when the decisions go badly, it is our most disempowered, disadvantaged members of our society often. And Roy is at the front end of thinking about civil rights and human rights. So Roy, do you want to just say a little bit about how you fit into this conversation, how the work you're doing kind of comes into these content issues?
So thank you very much, and thank you all for being here. And the way I fit into this conversation is the way I'm going to fit into this panel, and that's to be an agitator. All right, I love this discussion about education. But if you look at the U.S. education system right now, we are under attack. I'm really curious, who would teach media literacy and who would teach IT literacy in a situation right now we're in where we can't even acknowledge our history in our schools? So my role as the Vice President of Civil Rights at Meta, part of what I want to do here today is to tell every single one of you that you need to create a Vice President of Civil Rights in your corporation or company or organization. It is so incredibly important to have someone on the ground every day. As much as I love the oversight board, Meta is making decisions not only for 3.65 billion people, but we receive over 200 billion posts across our platforms every single day. 200 billion. Artificial intelligence can only cover so many of those. And so what my team does is we are looking at the effect, the impact of the decisions that Meta makes on your historically and systemically marginalized communities. Race, religion, ethnicity, gender, gender identity, sexual orientation, disability. We are looking at how our decisions impact those groups. We are the experts in the room on how those things happen. I come from the Civil Rights Division of the Department of Justice. We are looking constantly at what happens there and the speed with which decisions have to be made. I adore the Oversight Board. I adore the work they're doing. But we have to make decisions at a moment's notice and constantly be in the room as these decisions are being made. And I would say that every corporation needs this. It's the same like you have a tax expert, a privacy expert, an expert on communications. Having a civil rights expert that is looking, because we can talk about free speech all we want to, but this speech hurts people. It actually hurts people. And so we have to figure out ways to make sure we're not hurting people. We can have this debate about American politics and how dysfunctional it has become. But oftentimes what is happening is people are being hurt by things that people are saying, well, it's just free speech. You know, I have a right to say that. You mentioned Ebola. Let's talk about COVID. I mean, we're having a political debate about something that is killing right now 400 Americans every single day. Why are we having a political debate about that? That is actually at some level truly silly. But that's where we are right now because we want to have this debate about, well, you know, I should have a right to say something really, really stupid. Well, yeah, you have a right to say something stupid, but you don't have a right to say something that hurts other people. And that's the point of having a civil rights organization within your organization.
So let's open it up to a broader conversation about, is all of this enough? So I think that, there's been, great strides in both the Oversight Board and the civil rights work and the integrity work that you're doing. But we, as was pointed out in the US, of course, facing the midterm elections with continued conversations about not only election disinformation, but whether or not people who lose the election will actually admit that they've lost. What will that do to our democracy? We have obviously continued conflict zones and wars around the globe. How else or more, or what can the company do now? What should the tech companies do now to continue to empower users in this space? So I'm going to just open it up to whoever wants to speak first. Secretary Johnson.
So ultimately, the solution to the issue we're discussing lies with the public. And the public being more disciplined, being smarter about scrutinizing what they consume on a daily, moment by moment basis, and not just absorb whatever junk comes their way.
But can I press you on that? Because, I think there is a fair critique about the addictive behavior of some of this, fair critique about whether or not people know what trusted sources are, and that may be your point in terms of education. But how do we get to a point where people, when we have such distrust in our country for elected officials and for tech companies, how do we get to a point where I think what you're saying is it's the individual's responsibility?
Well, except I was about to finish the sentence.
Shouldn't have
after the
interrupted.
comma. So there are organizations like NewsGuard that are undertaking to signal to the consumer, green, yellow, red. This is a reliable source of information. This is a less than reliable source of information. This is a totally unreliable source of information. And I armed with that kind of good housekeeping seal of approval, people will, I think, learn to overlook some of the bull that comes through and focus more on the more established outlets that have standards. Many of us here grew up with a situation where we got our news from just 5 or 6 different sources, all of which were very traditional and had standards for intake and outtake. Now it's anybody with a keyboard. And so there ought to be a way that when I go on Google or some other news search engine, I can discern between what's reliable and what's less than reliable, what has an agenda, what may have a foreign influence behind it. And so there are ways in which we can better filter that.
Appreciate that. And apologies for interrupting you because it's a very good point. I think, it's probably that and, right? Which is absolutely educating people. And I want to bring in Nighat into the conversation again, just with regard to what else?
Yeah. So coming from a country where literacy rate is so low, and we are more than 200 million people in just one country, Pakistan, right? And I think when we are talking about putting onus on users, we have to be very careful that this conversation should be global and not centric to the jurisdictions where we assume that everyone understand what social media is and what kind of content that they are seeing. And when I'm saying this, I'm thinking about millions of young women and girls in Pakistan, in India, in Bangladesh, in Nepal, Sri Lanka, who have access to these platforms, very restricted access because of the social norms, patriarchal norms, how religion sort of plays part in our societies. But at the same time, it's not the language that they understand, right? And I think that's what exactly we are trying to do at the board, trying to tell the company and hold them accountable that not everyone understands English. If you say you are truly global platform, then you have to be truly global so that everyone around the world understand what they are seeing, how they can report, what community guidelines say, what reporting mechanisms are. So I think we have to be very careful when we put onus on the user, because platforms are very powerful, governments are very powerful, and those who are not powerful are the ones who are not in this conversation at the moment, and those are users. And I think it's important for the companies to uh, look into the resources, how many resources they are putting into empowering their users, not only around languages, but also around addressing disinformation, which has real world harm in some of the societies, and how quickly they are looking into it, how many human reviewers they are we only relying on automation? So I think there are like all these questions, and there is no simple answer. I believe personally that several solutions need to be the center of this conversation, and no one solution can address this. And one thing that I want to just briefly talk about regulation is that, and I said this yesterday as well, that when we talk about regulation, we need to think about the authoritative regimes as well. I personally don't want the countries who have power to define what we as users see online and what kind of content they can control in the name of morality or obscenity or blasphemy, or all the local laws that we have. I mean, good luck to me going back to Pakistan if this is live stream. But 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 this is something that we really need to look into, because most of the time, and it's been a decade. The conversation is around regulation coming from all the Western democracies. And when they copy paste, the other countries copy paste these regulations, those don't turn out well for us. So I think this should be part of the conversation while we are talking about regulations.
Yeah, I think that's critical. So we're hearing education, language access, but also a real knowledge of the ways in which different forms of government really impact the ability of users to move forward, and what we need to do systemically to think about that. I want to bring Dave in, who has a comment, and then Brent, I want you to start thinking about some of these, ways the company's responding on the user.
So I comment and then you fix it. Thanks, Anne. I just wanted to pick up on the education point and develop Roy's point slightly, because Secretary Johnson's of course right. Education is paramount. It is fundamental to getting to a place where people are safer online. But we talked earlier about how slow governments are to move here. Some more than others. But education, I mean, I worry how long it's going to take to do that. And the way I look at this is outside of our government work dealing with really nasty things online, in Digitalis, we look after some of the most powerful people in the world, and I would assume, therefore, relatively educated people. Okay, we look at very large families, very large corporations, and when we mine the deep web for those people to identify all of the flags that exist online, whether they be around reputation, around physical security threat, or around cyber threat, when we do that and present these attack audits to very, very smart people, the reaction is always, where the hell did you get all this information from? Right? Why is this information out there? And of course, the response is, well, you went on social media 15 years ago, and your teenage kids have been on for a long time. I mean, you put it there, right? And the reaction is, really, you're kidding? I mean, they're completely gobsmacked, right? That's the starting point, right? Some of the smartest people in this world have no idea what's happened with their private data. Now, I am also a huge fan of NewsGuard, and in fact, I'd love to name check this new search engine I met yesterday in here, and I can't remember their name, but there's a search engine that's working on a similar basis to NewsGuard, trying to, credit content with authenticity and what have you. But again, here's what I offset that against is, you know, it's years ago we identified that whilst there is declining trust amongst consumers in organizations and in governments, big tech included, guess what people trust? They trust the listings in Google, and they consider that the first thing that comes up is the most relevant to their search. We proved a long time ago, and have proved in court that, these algorithms especially of the search engines, favor the sensationalist, the salacious, the negative. These platforms are built to retain individuals in an echo chamber. The search engines return the very worst content, not the very most relevant content. Now, educating people around that, when actually we've got nearly 20 years of entrenched behavior, I think is going to be a very long process, and we can't rely on it.
So given that we can't rely on that solely, one measure, but Brent, what else are you going to do to fix this problem?
Well, I think it's hard not to do this work on a daily basis or listen to this panel and just reflect on how consequential these decisions are and how important this is to the world. And one thing I think that you asked in the prior question was, well, how do we make progress here? And I think that one of the things that's challenging is that any one solution is not enough. And so what we really need is, I think, a systems-based approach, and we need multiple solutions to move, some of which may be faster, some of which may be slower. And so that could be everything from how the industry itself steps up and industry standards. That's how the companies step up. That's work like the oversight board. That's greater regulation in the places that make sense. And then also on the education side and beyond that, one of the things we're also exploring is how do we actually find ways to do something that we've been calling community deliberations? And so how do we take some of the hardest types of issues, reminds me a little bit of what I think the ambassador was talking about, and say, there's a couple different approaches we could take here on this information or on climate or on ways in which we build new products. And what do you think are the right ways for us to build this? And it enables us to either go out to a very specific community that's impacted and hear their perspective on it, or it enables us to go out to Americans or to people globally and have them deliberate and weigh through how should we actually approach this. And I think that part of the value of it is, one is that it actually brings people along on what the real trade-offs are and the way that the products and policies operate. Another is that it enables other people to interrogate it, experts and the press and others to cover it. And then it also actually allows people to come together and find solutions that they actually reach more common ground on. And I was really struck when we have run some pilots on this of how you can have the mom in Park Slope who has her latte alongside someone who's wearing their Bama football hat, and they're deliberating on what is the right way to approach this issue, and they actually move together around something that's common cause. So we're encouraged by that as, I think, another kind of arrow in the quiver for ways to make progress here.
Thank you. That's helpful just to understand that, part of what the company is trying to do is to find more ways to hear from your users directly and to make it really meaningful, not just short conversations. So thank you for that. Ms. Han, I think you wanted to join the conversation.
Yeah, thank you very much. For me, it's really interesting to hear this US American approach. because I think we share a lot of things, especially what you said about values, rule of law, liberal values. I think this is something where we're very united, but we're having so many different starting points. Also, what you said about enforcement, about other countries. From a European perspective, we're now trying that tech companies need to have a legal representative in the European Union. Because I mean, with Meta, for example, that's not a problem. But we have many other companies that are sitting in especially non-democratic countries, channels like Telegram or something, which are very agitizing people, and it's difficult to act with law enforcement. So this is something very practical. But I think in many aspects of this, we're missing a backbone. We're still not having a working agreement on sharing of data between the EU and the US, which leads to the crazy situation that we have some data protection officers saying to local communes and authorities, guys, you actually should not be allowed to work with products like Microsoft Office because we cannot ensure that the data is stored according to European regulations. So we are actually missing a lot of needed infrastructure to have really a digital united world, at least in democratic countries. And the point that you touched upon, we have a lot of companies where platforms like Meta are amazing, especially for civil rights organization, for democracy, for opposition politicians, and they rely heavily on these services. And then we have governments that are requesting companies to restrict freedom of speech. And very often those companies are also following that, because you want to, of course, fulfill the regulation of a country you're operating in, but that sometimes goes against the values that you're working for back home. So I think it all comes back again that we really managed to work together on an international level to tackle these issues together.
Great. Ambassador Green.
Yeah. So let's go back to the notion of media literacy or IT literacy, however we're going to refer to it. I think we have to be careful by how we use that term. If the question is whether or not we can help people understand every aspect of emerging technologies, we'll never keep up, right? That's not the point. That's not media literacy in my book. It's instead developing a healthy skepticism of information flows, because we've always had these types of challenges. I remember on 9/11, I was a member of Congress. I was in my office on Capitol Hill, and my wife called me to say, the Capitol's on fire. And I went to the window and said, actually, no, it's not. I can see it from here. And she said, no, the crawler on the bottom of the screen says the Capitol's on fire. I said, no, really, it isn't. The difference now is how quickly this moves. We used to have, and Jay, you're right on. I mean, there used to be a point in not just political discourse, but public discourse in which we knew there would be enough time for, let's say, an editor to get an additional, to go and do, two-source verification and come back and scrutinize. That's gone because the misinformation goes around the globe twice before anybody knows what's happening. So instead, it seems to me that media literacy or IT literacy is broadly encouraging people to be skeptical. And then secondly, on top of that, and this sounds a bit pie in the sky, we don't need consensus. In fact, I would be very uncomfortable living in a society that was consensus driven. I am much more interested in constructive disagreement. I had an experience a few years ago in which I hosted an event and had two of our democracy champions, Madeleine Albright and John McCain, on the stage together. And it was a foreign policy discussion, and they disagreed on damn near everything. But at the end of it, people were excited because they disagreed civilly, constructively. I remember, John McCain saying, now, Madeleine, and Madeleine saying, now, John. And people came out of it saying, okay, I don't necessarily agree with everything, but you know what? That process of teeing up choices and understanding that we don't need consensus to move forward, that to me is how we have to figure to get back to, so that when people go online and do these searches and see things that people at least pause for a moment and recognize that it is a civic responsibility, I would argue not just in the US, but around the world, to pause and say, okay, let's look at another source as well. And again, that may be too big a hill to climb, but if we don't get towards that, I'm not sure we ever keep up.
Secretary Johnson, do you want to respond?
Yes. So Mark is right about the speed now with which information gets pushed to the public. It is a verified fact that in the immediate aftermath of a crisis, the disinformation that gets pushed out on cable news or elsewhere is all over the place, 9/11 being a perfect example. And as part of this discussion about social media, we can't let cable news off the hook here for the state of our democracy today. I mean, we all know, not naming any names, that there are cable news shows that have a premium on being outrageous and amping people up and making people angry. It's good for ratings to make people angry. And I was on Face the Nation on Sunday. Right after me was a professor from the University of Chicago named Robert Pape, who's done some very valuable research, first of all, on the demographics of the January 6th insurrectionists. And he makes the point on his findings that there are 13 million people in this country ready to resort to violence to restore Donald Trump to office. And he makes the point that a lot of that is stirred on cable news. It's, many of us like to bash social media, but cable news has a huge role in this. In my private life, I make a point of trying to be on MSNBC, CNN, but also Fox once in a while if I'm willing to suffer the abuse afterward. Democrat, go back under your rock. How dare you say that? And so what we see on television has to be part of this conversation as well. That's my point.
Yeah, I think it's a really important point, which is, there is an entire ecosystem here that is feeding off one another. And certainly the cable network news is part of it. And, frankly, also the discourse in our country, we just have to admit, changed radically with Donald Trump. And we are still, suffering from the fact that we had government officials who were spreading lies. And so that was, not that government officials hadn't lied before, but the extent of it was so grand that I think it was an ecosystem that was hard then to navigate. And I think it's a really critical point not to let that go. Roy was trying to get in, and then Glenn.
Yeah, so I don't mean to push back on you all the time here, but the whole idea of constructive disagreement is really a luxury of John McCain and Madeleine Albright. If you are from a community that has been put down and pushed down over and over again, you don't have the time to simply have a conversation, say, I disagree with you about the fact that slavery was a bad thing. I don't have time for that. I disagree with you that police brutality happens in the world. At some point, you have to call a lie a lie. And sometimes you have to call a lie aloud really loudly and in the street and protesting and civil disobedience and what's not. Now, the problem is that the other side is going to say, well, we were just engaging in civil disobedience when we attacked the Capitol. Well, you have to be able to call a lie, and I don't know who does it, but someone has to do it. We cannot both sides everything that happens in this world. And that's really where we are right now. We're just like, oh, you know what, let's just walk down the middle. We don't want to cause too much, one side doesn't like it, the other side doesn't like it. We'll just walk down the middle. We can't keep doing that when you're sitting there in the face of, and I think you mentioned, terrible harms that are happening to communities because of misinformation and disinformation. And I don't know who makes those calls, but someone has to make the call.
Well, Roy, I'm going to now push you. Who does make those calls? You're sitting as a civil rights leader in one of the most powerful companies in America. And I think that, all of us who have been, in the kind of progressive circles, people do ask, when is enough enough? Is there more the company can do? should the company be doing more to stop misinformation, to stop the lies? And so I'd kind of turn it back to you to ask you, is the company doing enough?
I think Jay should make the call. I just decided. Look, is the company doing enough? I think the company is doing a ton. I don't know what enough is. I think the oversight board, again, is a huge piece of this. I think I work very closely with Miranda Sissons, who's part of the human rights team, who leads the human rights team at Meta. Brent's work on governance is incredibly important. The analogy I put here is the U.S. Constitution was not, people who looked like me, people who looked like you had nothing to do with the creation of the U.S. Constitution. We have a chance now to kind of bring the entire world to the table to help us make these decisions. And I think we need to take advantage of that opportunity. First part is actually education, because we've done some work where we've realized that people don't even understand what content moderation is and the challenges around content moderation and everything else. When you give them that basic understanding, it leads to more constructive results at the end of the day. But part of it is the voices that have not been heard in the creation of constitutions and a lot of these nation states need to be brought to the table so that we hear what they are feeling, what they are thinking. And that's a huge part of it. I don't have a clear solution as to who the point person is, but it's got to be, in some ways, everyone.
Yeah, and I think that's a really critical point. I want to bring Glenn and Dave in, but before I do, I just want to rest on this for 1 second, which is this notion of how do we actually get to more decentralized governance. And so let me put a pin in. I want to kind of open up that conversation in a moment, because we are seeing that in other spheres of the web, in Web 3.0, and I think in cryptocurrency, blockchain, and I think there's a question about whether more of that can come into what's happening now. But I know Glenn and Dave wanted to comment on the current conversation. Glenn?
Well, thank you. First, I wanted to associate myself with, I think, Roy's important statement about however we solve this problem, the achievement of the elevation of objective truth and facts must be an important part of that equation. In addition to having robust debate, you should have the achievement of some sense of what is true remain very important. I also wanted to just make one more comment on the question about education. And I also want to concede something. I think Brent's got a hard job. He's up here trying to take some slings and arrows today, but putting himself out and allowing us to say what we want to say in terms of ideas for how Meta can constructively engage on these questions. I do think on the question of education, it's a long-term and hard challenge. There is a role for public-private partnerships. Companies with resources like Meta are actually, I think, well-placed to probably produce, for example, some really pithy short videos that help people understand how it is that actors in social media spaces try to influence their thinking. Because at the end of the day, that's what it comes back to a large extent, is what you see on your screen has been put there by various actors for certain reasons, and they want to influence your thinking. It might be your thinking to bias towards a commercial product. It might be your thinking to bias towards a way of seeing a political issue or another social issue. But I do think any way we could help people understand that environment would help here. And I'll tell you just personally where I'm coming from with this. I did some advising for some private sector companies in the data space, and I did a personal project. And I challenged myself to read the terms and conditions of the 20 most apps that I used most. And most of it is legalese and very hard to understand. And I did some third-party research on it as well. And I came to the following conclusion. A little bit of knowledge about how social media actually works is scary. But a lot of knowledge about it is actually comforting. Why is it comforting? Because you start to understand the incentives of the people in the system, and they are rational. You may not like them, but the incentives are rational. And when you start to understand, it takes away the fear, at least to my mind, of what's going on behind the scenes. And I think people are more able to interact in a much more productive way once they kind of understand that. Since we're on the stage, and I wanted to throw out one more idea, and again, I don't think this is something Brent can commit to today.
But we're here to listen.
Insofar as I've been given this platform, I just wanted to throw out one notion which I think might be a really exciting and yet probably not lucrative project for Meta to take on, which would be assign a team. You have an opportunity. You are a major player in the metaverse and the creation of a technology space which will yield all sorts of exciting new avenues for people to communicate with all sorts of challenges. I would love to see a team created, whose job is to think of ways to keep politics out of the metaverse for as long as possible, as hard as that is. Wouldn't that be a fun challenge? So that's just an idea to leave.
That is a fun challenge. I'm not sure Brent's listening. Dave?
And thanks. Quick one from me. Look, I think I remain of the view that education is paramount, but I have to say, I think it's a complete cop out to say that because cable news in the US is allowed to write ludicrous lies, that we need to educate people to multi-source. You know, there is a model that works here. You know, in the UK, our media is accountable. They have to fact check. They have to multi-source things. You know, and they are liable, you know, under multiple different laws for writing things that cause harm. You know, that model works. I think it was 1964 when the US diverged considerably from the UK on this point. You know, in Sullivan versus New York Times in 1964, when the US decided it was fine to say anything, no matter how wrong it was and how damaging it was, about a public servant. And I think later under Reagan's FCC, it was expanded to include anyone in the public eye. You know, and it's a really bad example because I appreciate in the US she's a polarizing figure. But, you know, Hillary Clinton, you know, and the things that were written about her online, you know, you know, if I were to pick someone in this room and go online and say, you know, you're running a pedophile ring and you're doing all of these hideous things and write all these damaging things, which are at the very least highly damaging to reputation and person, at the worst to personal safety and the safety of others, that's not okay. And somebody needs to stop that. And in some places, those things, there are mechanisms to stop those things. I don't think the answer to that is, hey, educate people that people will say something really hideous that could damage you, destroy you physically and mentally.
Yeah, and of course, I can't let that go without saying one word about it, which is, you know, as somebody who worked for Hillary Clinton for many years and was on her presidential campaign, I think sometimes people don't realize just how confusing it was. So I was her senior policy advisor, but one of the things that we did is I actually asked my whole team to go knock on doors in Iowa and New Hampshire. And I'd worked for Hillary on and off for 20 years, and I began knocking on doors and hearing these lies. And it was really shocking and also very confusing as to where they were coming from. Of course, you know, fast forward then to about a year later when John Podesta's email was hacked, in which therefore everybody who ever emailed him's personal cell phones and emails were put online, including mine. I then began getting calls literally with people with Russian accents calling. I was running the presidential transition. And I think that there was the ecosystem that created was not only you know, of course, it sounds like I have PTSD. Yes, I do. Is that not only was it harmful personally, but it was, you know, we were trying to do what the Congress and the president before us had asked us to do, which is to set up a, you know, peaceful transition of power. We were working very closely with the Obama administration, but also in the same building as the Trump team. And you know, you know, kind of damage it was doing to our governance was very real. So I think you're right, which is that it's the harm that's caused, whether it's to disempowered members of our community or to our democracy or to both. You know, I think we do all have great responsibility. And so I am heartened by this conversation because I don't think any one of us is taking it lightly. And I think, you know, we don't take it lightly also about the responsibility that's being given to people like Brent to, you know, kind of not only not solve these problems, but to think hard about what more can happen. So, Brent, I'm going to turn it back to you to talk a little bit, not to hold you responsible for everything I just said, but to instead talk about, you know, how do we keep going? You know, whether it's decentralized governance models or more that the companies should be thinking about, or how can we all continue as, you know, leaders in our own right, civil, you know, in the civil society in our communities, help the company continue to think through these.
Well, thanks for the question. And I wanted to say thanks for all the feedback, the ideas. And if Silicon Valley had a monopoly on solutions, we'd be in a much better place today, I think, than where we are. And so it's valuable to be out there. It's valuable to get a bunch of solutions. And it's valuable to have folks not just on this stage, but in the audience and across the world thinking about how we make progress. And one of the things that I think we can also kind of take away, and I'm reflecting on your experience, Anne, and some of it was mine too. I was involved at the time around the campaign as well. Was that I think that there's a bunch of kind of lessons from some of the pain and some of the hard lessons over the last few years, and that the challenges that we're having with the existing internet are an opportunity for all of us to step back and reflect and think through what is the next phase of the internet that we want to have. And so that gets at the questions about the metaverse. And so the metaverse is probably about 10 years away in a real kind of major at scale form. And it's going to be it really is going to be the next phase of how we communicate, how people come together. It will be incredibly different in a lot of ways from the existing internet, but it will build on these rails. But the good news on kind of spotting, I think, where we're going is that it's a chance for many of us to start to think through, well, what do we want that next phase of the internet to look like? And who should hold power? And with that, that's actually one of the things that I've really come to appreciate about Web3. And there are a lot of things that I disagree with, and there are a lot of things that leave me scratching my head about it, not least crypto kitties, and I'm still not sure exactly what the Constitution DAO was. But what I think is encouraging is that folks have actually put governance and product governance at the center of how they're actually building products. And one of the takeaways, I think, of the last 10 years, 20 years of the internet has to be that product governance is every bit as important as corporate governance, and who gets to decide on what our products look like, what the internet looks like, and then what the metaverse looks like. All of us need to start having those conversations now, thinking about our reflections and figuring out how we want to build something that builds upon and is better than what we have today.
I think that's a perfect segue to kind of doing a round robin, because would like to hear everyone's idea on, we are in this unique position as the metaverse starts to really think about what have we learned from where we've been, both in the real world and in these platforms. And so therefore, where should we go? So I'm just going to go down the line and just ask you, one or two sentences about what you hope for and what you've learned that you hope can be translated into the metaverse.
Yeah, I think we at the oversight board also thinking, how board looks into metaverse, what content looks like, what content moderation will look like, and what exactly is the content in the metaverse, right? So thinking about all the different harmful behaviors, for instance. So I think there is like this conversation is going on within the board, but outside the board as well. But I think with the current internet, I would like to say that we need several solutions, and I guess oversight board is a self-governance model which sort of it's a good precedent that has been set, and I think other platforms need to look into this. um, I have often feel that I have felt that most of the time several other powerful platforms are not part of the conversation, and they get away with it. A lot of jurisdictions and contests, the kind of harm that have been inflicting upon marginalized and vulnerable communities, that's are being unheard, and their voices are not being heard. So it's important for them to look into these models as well and see how they can self-govern themselves besides the regulatory models. And I want to tell audience and my fellow panelists that we are doing everything in our power to hold Meta accountable. Not only holding them accountable, but also releasing our transparency reports, what we have done and what Meta has done in terms of the recommendations that we are giving in our decisions.
I want to go back to where I started. I think the essential, uh, one of the essential goals that Meta should be taking up is demystifying this process. It's crucial that the decision points are teed up, um, because everybody has a point of view, of course, but also when you tee up for them the choices that have to be made and what the implications could be for actually things that they care about, it causes, I think, more thoughtfulness. More importantly, when people don't understand what those choices are, and when people don't know, for example, who's on the board, we're in a time in history when everybody projects the worst. There's so much paranoia out there. If I tell people that I was um, on stage with the accountability board for Meta, people are going to say, "Aha, it's a setup. We told you." So we have to demystify this, and we have to go back to choices and recognize I'm not always going to agree with what the decision may be. I don't have to. I'm more comfortable when I know that things are being considered and looked at. So the more that you can do to demystify that process, I think that would be a great accomplishment.
So there's in a free and open society, our greatest strength is also our greatest weakness. I can hold the entire world in my hand with this device. 30 years ago, as recently as 30 years ago, if I wanted to find a speech that Roy Austin gave, uh, I'd have to go to a
You'd never
library,
find it.
microfilm, whatever, New York Public Library, maybe. Now I can pull it up in 10 seconds. We have at our fingertips so much news and information. The good part about that is in Russia, if the average Russian citizen wanted to find out about the war crimes that Vladimir Putin is committing on a daily basis, they could pull themselves away from state sponsored TV and go to social media. And if you put in Vladimir Putin war criminal, you'd find a lot of what we read daily in the New York Times if you bother to pick up the device and look for it. The flip side of that is that we are, as human beings, we are inevitably drawn to things that we like, that tend to agree with us, that revalidate our own likes, dislikes, suspicions, paranoias, prejudices. Um, and so that's why I always say that at the end of the day, it does track back to the average consumer and our ability to challenge ourselves, to challenge our family members, our coworkers, to expand their own horizons and not simply go to what's at the top of the search engine. Yes, I love what they say. Let me go back to that. I agree with everything Mark said about transparency. People are naturally suspicious of power, and especially if the power is not transparent. So this has been a great discussion. I think we need to have many more like this. Thanks.
Thank you very much from my side as well. I actually learned a lot, and from a European perspective, we often have a less optimistic approach. We're not so good at seeing opportunities, possibilities. We're rather more like, okay, yeah, I think there's a risk. I think we should have a regulation on that. And the regulation is always following a precautionary principle. And the narrative in the European Union is what should be legal offline should be legal online. In my opinion, this is a no-brainer. I mean, we're not in a complete Wild West situation without any rules. We don't need to reinvent the wheel with every piece of legislation that we're doing. And regarding the metaverse, I already have colleagues that say, oh, how do we handle when you can buy property there? Do we need a new regulation on buying property in the metaverse? How do you ensure safety and security of your metaverse character? So I sometimes wish we had a bit more of an American perspective and seeing opportunities. But I think together, combined, we have a strength there. And I think the most important thing is that we, especially as transatlantic democratic partners, are in a dialogue. How can we shape this future, but also in a dialogue between companies and legislators? So I think this is going to be really the deciding part if this can be a fruitful new part of our societies.
So I don't want to be a downer and angry the entire time I'm on this panel. So let me talk about the metaverse and a conversation I just had with someone, and that is they were talking about currently incarcerated people. and the idea of bringing VR into prisons and jails and how that could be used to teach people to become anything from an electrician to a surgeon. That you can use VR in that way, and it's actually really amazing. And the idea that we can use this technology to bring the sciences, engineering to the entire world, no matter where you are, on a VR machine, you can actually feel like you are doing it. Um, I want to see that be the promise, which is going to be upsetting to my 19-year-old son, who's like, the gaming's going to be awesome. No, the possibilities of having the entire world learn constructive skills is what is awesome, and I want to see us use it more for that than for just the fun and games and the nastiness that we often see in social media technology.
Thank you for involving me in the conversation as you embark and stand on the precipice of rolling out an incredible new and powerful technology. I just want to make one prediction, and that is that on this road ahead of you, you will not be able to please everyone. But I do think my takeaways from today are um, if you bias towards truth where possible, if you attempt radical transparency in terms of people's understanding of how the user experience is determined, and if you try to de-emphasize politics where possible, I think you're going to be starting off on a good track. Thank you.
Likewise, thanks for including me. I think we've covered some really important ground, and there's so many areas we haven't even touched on. I think for me, the metaverse is going to put on steroids some of the data privacy issues we have. Is going to put surveillance capitalism on steroids. I think Meta has taken a brilliant first leadership step in the sector with the oversight board, and it's applaudable. I think the next step, to use Glenn's words, is radical transparency around algorithms, business models, modus operandi, and not to dodge the privacy question.
And I'll say on this that I think building on a bunch of these comments and implicit in them is also that the time for the tech companies to build on their own is over, and that we're in an era where we need to partner, we need to listen, we need to find ways to bring transparency to a bunch of these matters and add process so that you can hear through what the different decisions are and hear many more voices about how to build. And the metaverse is an opportunity to do that from the ground floor. And it'd be like going back to kind of the dial-up phase of the internet when I remember kind of like trying to click through and you'd get that like, do folks remember that? And we have a real opportunity, I think, on this to build differently and build together and to hear from many more people.
Thank you so much. First, I wanted to say thank you to Brent and to Meta for your leadership. Thank you to Roy as well for your leadership. Thank you to Nighat for your leadership in terms of all the work you're doing to try to get this right. And then thank you to the panel who I think really opened all of our eyes to these issues. I think, as we sit here today, some of you in the room were born into a world in which this was just always the way it was, which is you had technology, you're digital natives, and those are those of us who are now old enough to remember that that was not always the way. I come from a small town in Maine. My parents were the first to go to college in their family, and to have the opportunities that were afforded to many of us because of technology, because of education, and the ability to learn so much more about the world. I feel so lucky every day when I feel like I might maybe slightly undereducated about something that I can simply Google it, or I can simply go and find through whatever mechanism on tech a way to get there. So I want to say to Roy, I think this is an optimistic way to think about what more can we do to continue to open up the minds and the worlds of so many people, and not forget that that's where we are, but also just like we all have responsibility. And I think that sometimes people get frustrated, whether it's with politics or with tech, and they simply want to get angry and walk away. I just don't think we have the luxury to do that. And so I want to say thank you to each of you for spending your time thinking about these hard questions. And to the audience, I want to say what I think you've heard from Brent and others is just a complete openness to say, help us think through these hard problems. please make sure that we're hearing from you and from others because there's a real openness to understand that this is going to take a lot of intellectual superpower from throughout the entire globe to get this right and to continue to ensure that the consequences are mitigated in terms of any harm that might be done. And so really thank you to everyone. Thank you to Brent, and thank you for all being here today.